Hi, I'm Allison, and last Tuesday I did something that would have been unthinkable to me just 48 hours earlier. I served my own parents with a formal eviction notice and watched them pack their designer luggage while standing in the driveway of the house my grandmother left me. The same house where they'd just forced me to sleep in the garage like some unwanted stranger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's what they didn't know when they handed me those musty old blankets and pointed toward the door that leads to where I park my car. I'd been documenting everything. Every dismissive comment, every entitled demand, every moment they treated my home like their personal vacation rental while treating me like hired help. And when they woke up that Wednesday morning expecting breakfast and clean towels, they got legal papers instead. The look on my mother's face when she realized her golden boy Brandon wasn't going to save her this time? Worth every sleepless hour I'd spent on that concrete floor, listening to them laugh through the thin walls about how I'd finally learned my place. But the real shock wasn't watching them scramble to find a hotel room in peak tourist season. It was discovering just how deep their sense of entitlement ran, and how far they'd go to avoid taking responsibility for decades of treating me like a guest in my own life. The whole nightmare started 3 months ago when my father called with what he described as exciting family news. His voice had that particular tone he used when he'd already made decisions that would affect my life without bothering to ask my opinion first. "Allison, your mother and I have been planning something special," he announced, as if he was about to reveal a surprise party instead of hijacking my summer. "We're finally going to visit Arizona. We've booked that photography workshop in Sedona we've been talking about for years." I shifted the phone to my other ear while I stirred the pasta sauce I'd been making for dinner, trying to process this information. My parents lived in Scottsdale, barely an hour from my place in Tempe, but they talked about visiting me like it required international travel documentation. "That's great, Dad," I said carefully, already sensing the trap being laid. "When are you thinking of going?" "Well, that's the thing," he continued, and there it was. "The workshop runs for 2 weeks, and you know how your mother feels about hotels. All those germs and questionable thread counts. We were hoping we could stay with you instead. It would be so much more comfortable, and we'd get to spend real quality time together." Quality time. As if the reason we rarely spent time together had anything to do with geography and not the fact that every interaction with my parents felt like a performance review where I somehow always fell short of their expectations. I looked around my small but carefully maintained living room, imagining my mother's reaction to my secondhand furniture and DIY art projects. "For 2 weeks?" I asked, buying time while my mind raced through all the reasons this was a terrible idea. "Oh, Allison, don't be dramatic," my mother's voice joined the conversation. Apparently she'd been listening on speakerphone the whole time. "It's not like we're asking you to build us an addition. We just need somewhere clean to sleep and maybe a decent cup of coffee in the morning. Surely you can manage that much." The way she said, "manage that much," made it clear this wasn't really a request. It was an expectation wrapped in the thinnest veneer of politeness. I found myself nodding even though they couldn't see me, already slipping into the old familiar pattern of agreeing to things that made me uncomfortable rather than dealing with the guilt trip that would follow if I said no. "Of course," I heard myself saying. "You're always welcome here." The silence that followed lasted just long enough for me to realize I'd walked directly into whatever they'd planned next. "Wonderful," my mother exclaimed, her voice suddenly bright and enthusiastic. "We'll arrive next Friday afternoon. Oh, and Allison? Brandon might join us for the second weekend. You know how much he loves those spiritual retreats, and it would be such a shame for him to miss out on the family bonding." Brandon. My older brother who'd managed to turn his quarter-life crisis into a full-time career, floating from one expensive, transformative experience to another while my parents funded his journey to enlightenment. The same Brandon who'd borrowed my car 3 years ago and returned it with a cracked windshield and an empty gas tank, then acted like I was being petty when I asked him to cover the repairs. "Sure," I said, because what else could I say at that point? The more the merrier. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen feeling like I'd just agreed to host a hurricane. My house had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. I'd been using the second bedroom as my home office since I started freelancing as a graphic designer, but I could move my work setup to the living room for a couple of weeks. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it was manageable. What worried me more was the way my parents had presented this as a done deal rather than a favor they were asking. There had been no discussion of dates that might work better for me, no acknowledgement that disrupting my routine and workspace for 2 weeks might be an inconvenience worth mentioning. But this was how things had always worked in my family. My parents made plans, and everyone else adjusted accordingly. When I was 15 and had saved up for months to attend art camp, those plans got cancelled so we could afford Brandon's emergency summer school tuition after he'd failed algebra. When I graduated college and wanted to celebrate with my friends, the party got moved to accommodate my mother's book club schedule. Even my grandmother's funeral had been planned around Brandon's meditation retreat schedule, as if grief operated on a timeline that could be conveniently rearranged. The weeks leading up to their visit passed in a blur of anxious preparation. I deep cleaned every surface of my house, bought new sheets for the guest room, and stocked the refrigerator with the organic everything my mother preferred. I moved my computer and drawing tablet to a folding table in the corner of the living room and practiced explaining my current projects in ways that might sound impressive rather than just adequate. I even bought fancy coffee beans and a French press, remembering how my mother always complained that my regular coffee maker produced bitter swill. The Thursday night before they arrived, I couldn't sleep. I kept walking through the house, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting, second-guessing furniture arrangements that had worked perfectly fine for the 3 years I'd lived there. Something about preparing for my parents' visit made me see my own space through their eyes, and I didn't like what I imagined they'd think. The throw pillows I'd sewn myself suddenly looked amateur. The paintings I'd bought from local artists looked cheap. Even my carefully tended herb garden visible through the kitchen window seemed somehow insufficient. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was my home, bought with my own money, maintained through my own hard work. I'd saved for 2 years to afford the down payment, and I'd spent countless weekends learning to fix things myself rather than hiring contractors I couldn't afford. Every improvement, from the restored hardwood floors to the hand-painted bathroom tiles, represented hours of effort and small victories. But none of that seemed to matter when I imagined my mother's appraising glance or my father's subtle suggestions for improvements I could make if I just applied myself more seriously. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of blazing Arizona heat that made the air shimmer like water. I'd taken the day off work to make sure everything was perfect, spending the morning on final preparations and the early afternoon pacing nervously between rooms. When I heard car doors slamming in my driveway, my stomach clenched with a familiar mixture of anticipation and dread. My parents emerged from their rental car looking like they'd just stepped out of a travel magazine. My mother wore a flowing linen dress in a shade of cream that would show every speck of dust, paired with sandals that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. My father had on the kind of casual button-down that only looked casual if you knew how much designer casual clothing cost. They both wore sunglasses that reflected the desert landscape like they were surveying territory they might consider purchasing. "Allison," my mother called out, her arms extended in a gesture that looked warm until you got close enough to realize it was the kind of hug that avoided actual contact. "Look at this place. You've really done something with it, haven't you?" The way she said something made it clear she wasn't sure whether that something was good or bad. I led them through the front door, watching their faces as they took in the living room I'd arranged and rearranged a dozen times. My father nodded approvingly at the ceiling fans, commenting on how practical they were for the climate. My mother's gaze lingered on the artwork, her expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she was cataloging things to discuss with my father later in private. "Where should we put our bags?" my father asked, already hefting 2 large suitcases from the car. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. We packed light, but you know how your mother is about having options. I showed them to the guest room, which had been my office until that morning. I'd managed to fit most of my work equipment into the living room, though the folding table looked awkward wedged between the couch and the window. "This is perfect," my mother declared, though she was already moving things around, adjusting the lamp angle and repositioning the decorative pillows I'd arranged on the bed. "Very cozy. We'll be quite comfortable here." The first evening went better than I'd expected. We ordered takeout from a Thai restaurant my parents had never tried, and they seemed genuinely interested in hearing about my recent design projects. My mother even complimented the way I'd arranged the living room, though she suggested that different curtains might open up the space more effectively. By the time we said goodnight, I was feeling cautiously optimistic about the next 2 weeks. That optimism lasted exactly until Saturday morning, when I woke up to find my mother rearranging my kitchen cabinets. "I hope you don't mind," she said when she noticed me standing in the doorway in my pajamas. I was looking for the coffee filters and realized how much more efficient this layout could be. "You'll thank me later when you can actually find things." I watched her move my carefully organized spices to a cabinet I could barely reach, while relocating my everyday dishes to a spot that would require me to walk around the kitchen island every time I wanted a plate. "Mom," I started, but she was already explaining her organizational philosophy, which apparently involved storing items based on some complex system that made sense only to her. Your grandmother always said a well-organized kitchen is the heart of a well-organized life, she continued, now tackling the cabinet where I kept my baking supplies. Poor thing never quite got the hang of it herself, which is probably why she left you this little place in such a state. The casual criticism of my grandmother hit me like a slap. My grandmother had left me this house not because it was in a state, but because she knew I was the only one in the family who would actually live in it and love it rather than selling it for the equity. She'd spent her final years here, tending the garden and hosting neighborhood potlucks, creating exactly the kind of warm, welcoming space my mother would never understand. The house wasn't an estate, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Grandma took excellent care of it. My mother made a non-committal humming sound that somehow managed to convey disagreement without requiring her to actually argue. Of course she did her best, she said in the tone people use when they mean the exact opposite. But you have to admit, some updates were needed. That avocado green bathroom was practically a historical artifact. I'd loved that bathroom. The vintage tiles and original fixtures had character and charm that you couldn't buy in any modern renovation. I'd spent weeks carefully restoring the grout and polishing the chrome until it gleamed. But to my mother, anything that wasn't currently trending on home improvement shows was automatically classified as outdated and embarrassing. By the time my father emerged from the guest room, my mother had completely reorganized 3 cabinets and was eyeing the refrigerator like her next conquest. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said to me, then turned to my mother with approval. "Patricia, you've been busy. This kitchen looks much more functional already." The casual assumption that my kitchen had needed their intervention stung more than I wanted to admit. I'd been living here successfully for 3 years, cooking meals and entertaining friends without any organizational emergencies. But somehow my parents had been in my house for less than 24 hours and had already identified multiple ways I'd been doing things wrong. "I thought we could visit that new art gallery downtown today," I suggested, hoping to redirect their energy toward activities that wouldn't involve critiquing my life choices. "They have an exhibition of local landscape painters that's supposed to be really stunning." "That sounds lovely," my mother agreed, though she was still rearranging my spice rack. "But first, we really should discuss the guest room situation. Your father's back has been bothering him, and that mattress is quite a bit firmer than we're used to. Do you have any extra padding we could add?" I didn't have extra padding because I'd bought the best mattress I could afford, specifically for the guest room. But I found myself nodding and promising to pick up a mattress topper while we were out, adding another item to the growing list of things I apparently needed to fix in order to make my home acceptable for their visit. The gallery visit became a shopping expedition for mattress toppers, followed by a stop at a home goods store where my mother found several items she thought would help with my decorating challenges. By the time we returned home, I was carrying bags full of things I hadn't wanted and couldn't really afford, purchased to solve problems I hadn't known I had until my parents pointed them out. Sunday brought Brandon's arrival along with 2 enormous duffel bags and a guitar case, because apparently his spiritual journey required musical accompaniment. He burst through my front door like he was returning to his childhood home rather than visiting his sister's house for the first time in 2 years. "Allison," he announced, sweeping me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and something that might have been sage. "Look at you, playing house in Grandma's old place. This is so authentically vintage, I love it." The way he said, "playing house," made it sound like a temporary game rather than my actual life. Within an hour of his arrival, Brandon had claimed the living room as his meditation space, moving my furniture to create what he called better energy flow. My carefully arranged workstation got relocated to a corner of the kitchen, where the morning light that was perfect for design work was blocked by the refrigerator. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, though he was already rolling out his yoga mat in the space where my coffee table used to be. "I'm going through a really intense spiritual transformation right now, and I need somewhere I can center myself. You understand?" I understood that Brandon's spiritual transformations always seemed to require other people to accommodate his needs while he figured himself out. But saying that out loud would make me the unsupportive sister who didn't appreciate his journey toward enlightenment, so I just nodded and tried to figure out how to use my laptop in a kitchen corner where the Wi-Fi signal barely reached. That evening, my mother announced that she'd made dinner reservations at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try. "It's that new farm-to-table place downtown," she explained. "The reviews are excellent, and we thought it would be nice to treat you to something special." The something special turned out to be a meal that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a month, at a restaurant where the portions were designed more for Instagram than actual hunger. But the real shock came when the check arrived and my father handed it to me with a smile. "This was your idea, wasn't it?" he said. "We thought you'd want to handle it since you're the local expert." I stared at the check, trying to process the fact that my parents had chosen an expensive restaurant, made reservations without asking what I could afford, and then assumed I'd be paying for their meal. Brandon was already pulling out his phone to post pictures of his artfully arranged vegetables, apparently oblivious to the financial ambush happening across the table. "Dad," I said carefully, "I think there might be some confusion. I didn't suggest this restaurant, and I'm not really in a position to cover dinner for everyone." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. My mother's face went through several expressions before settling on disappointed resignation. "Oh," she said finally. "We just assumed. Well, you're always so independent, and this is your city. We thought you'd want to show us a good time." The guilt hit immediately, which was exactly what it was designed to do. Here I was, being stingy about treating my parents to one nice meal during their visit, after they'd traveled all this way to spend time with me. Never mind that they'd chosen the restaurant and the expensive wine without consulting me about the budget. Never mind that I was already spending money I didn't have on mattress toppers and home improvements to make them more comfortable. I reached for my wallet, calculating how long I'd need to eat ramen and skip coffee shop visits to make up for this unexpected expense. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "My treat." Brandon looked up from his phone long enough to add, "You're the best, sis. This spiritual cleanse has been amazing, but I've been craving real food for weeks." As we walked back to my car, my mother linked her arm through mine in a gesture that might have seemed affectionate to anyone watching. "Thank you for tonight, sweetheart," she said. "It's so nice to see you doing well enough to treat your family. Your father and I were a little worried about your finances, living in this little place all by yourself." The little place that I owned outright, without any help from them or anyone else. The little place that represented years of careful saving and smart financial decisions. But somehow, in the span of one dinner check, my independence had been reframed as evidence that I was finally stable enough to take care of them. The next morning brought the first real glimpse of what the following 2 weeks would actually look like. I woke up to the sound of my mother's voice carrying through the thin walls, talking on the phone with someone about how rustic my living situation was, and how it was exactly what you'd expect from someone who chose practicality over style. She was speaking in that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound charitable while actually being cruel, the same voice she'd used to describe my college boyfriend as interesting when she meant completely unsuitable. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, listening to her catalog my shortcomings for whoever was on the other end of that call. The outdated light fixtures that were actually vintage pieces I'd carefully restored. The cramped kitchen that was perfectly sized for one person who actually cooked. The garden that needed professional attention even though I'd spent 2 years learning to grow herbs and vegetables in the desert climate. Each criticism felt like a small blade, sharp and precise, designed to cut just deep enough to hurt without drawing obvious blood. When I finally emerged from my bedroom, I found my entire morning routine had been completely disrupted. My father had spread his photography equipment across the dining table where I usually ate breakfast while checking emails. Brandon was in the middle of what he called his sunrise meditation practice, which involved sitting cross-legged in front of my living room window while making soft humming sounds that made concentration impossible. My mother had apparently decided that my coffee maker was insufficient for their needs and was in the process of researching espresso machines on her laptop, which she'd plugged in where my phone charger usually went. "Good morning, sleepyhead," my mother said without looking up from her screen. "I was just telling your Aunt Linda about this adorable little house. She's so impressed that you've managed to make it work for you." The way she emphasized make it work suggested that my living situation was some kind of creative problem-solving exercise rather than a deliberate choice. I'd fallen in love with this house the moment I saw it, with its original hardwood floors and the way the morning light filled the kitchen through windows that faced east toward the mountains. But apparently my emotional attachment to my own home was just evidence of making the best of a less-than-ideal situation. "I need to get some work done this morning," I said, gesturing toward the corner where I'd been forced to relocate my computer setup. "I have a client presentation tomorrow." Brandon opened his eyes just long enough to give me a look of profound disappointment. "Allison, we're family," he said in the patient tone he'd learned during his brief stint with meditation retreats. "Work will always be there, but how often do we get to spend quality time together like this?" Quality time that apparently involved me being unable to access my own workspace while they took over every surface in my house. But pointing that out would make me the selfish sister who cared more about money than family bonding, so I just smiled and tried to figure out how to balance my laptop on the narrow counter space that wasn't occupied by my father's camera lenses. The morning deteriorated from there. My mother decided that my shower pressure was unacceptable and spent 20 minutes explaining various pump systems I could install to fix the problem. My father critiqued my internet speed and suggested I upgrade to a more professional package since I was trying to run a business from home. Brandon announced that the energy in my house was stagnant and offered to perform a sage cleansing ritual that would require me to open all the windows and doors, which would let in the blazing desert heat and drive my electricity bill through the roof. By noon, I felt like a stranger in my own space. Every room had been rearranged according to someone else's preferences. Every system I'd developed for living and working had been deemed insufficient and in need of improvement. Even my choice of hand soap had been quietly replaced with something my mother had brought from home, because apparently my selection wasn't moisturizing enough for their skin types. The breaking point came when I discovered that my father had moved my grandmother's antique writing desk to make room for his photography equipment. The desk had been my grandmother's most treasured possession, where she'd written letters to friends and family for over 40 years. I'd placed it by the window where she used to sit, and I'd kept her fountain pen in the small drawer exactly where she'd left it. But my father had decided it was taking up too much space in the dining area and had shoved it into a corner where it was partially hidden behind Brandon's guitar case. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "could we move Grandma's desk back where it was? It has sentimental value, and I like being able to see it from the kitchen." He looked up from arranging his camera equipment like I'd interrupted something important. "Oh, that old thing? I didn't realize you were still using it. But we need this space for the workshop materials. This lighting is perfect for product photography, and will only be here for 2 weeks. Only 2 weeks, as if that made it acceptable to relocate furniture that meant something to me. As if my sentimental attachment to my grandmother's belongings was less important than his hobby photography. I wanted to explain that I wasn't still using the desk so much as honoring my grandmother's memory by keeping it in the place where she'd been happiest. But my father had already turned back to his cameras, dismissing the conversation as settled. I moved the desk back myself, struggling with the weight while Brandon watched from his meditation spot without offering to help. "You're really attached to old stuff, aren't you?" he observed, like my connection to family history was some kind of psychological quirk rather than normal human emotion. "Maybe that's why you're having trouble moving forward with your life." The casual psychoanalysis stung more than it should have. Brandon had been in therapy for 6 months and apparently considered himself qualified to diagnose everyone else's emotional problems. Never mind that I'd built a successful freelance career and bought my own home while he was still living off our parents' support at age 28. According to his newly acquired wisdom, my problem wasn't his inability to respect my space, it was my unhealthy attachment to the past. That afternoon, while my parents went to their photography workshop, I tried to catch up on the work I'd been unable to do that morning. But Brandon had declared the living room his creative space and was practicing guitar with an amplifier that made the walls vibrate. When I asked if he could use headphones, he explained that his music needed to breathe and that confining it to headphones would diminish its spiritual impact. I retreated to my bedroom, but the sound still carried through the walls, making it impossible to concentrate on the logo design I needed to finish. Every few minutes, Brandon would stop playing and call out comments about my house that he apparently thought were helpful. "You know, this place has great bones," he announced. "With the right renovation, it could be really impressive. Have you thought about knocking out that wall between the kitchen and living room?" The wall he wanted to knock out was load-bearing, which I knew because I'd actually researched the house's structure before buying it. But Brandon's renovation suggestions weren't based on knowledge or practicality, they were based on what he'd seen on television shows where people with unlimited budgets transformed spaces in unrealistic time frames. The fact that I couldn't afford major renovations, and that I actually liked my house the way it was, didn't factor into his vision for my improvement. When my parents returned that evening, they were full of enthusiasm about the techniques they'd learned and the other workshop participants they'd met. "There's a lovely couple from Seattle who are documenting their retirement travels," my mother told me as she unpacked camera equipment in my living room. "They have the most beautiful RV, completely customized with professional photography equipment. They make it look so effortless." The comparison was subtle but clear. Here were people who were doing retirement right, with the financial resources and sophisticated equipment to document their adventures properly. Unlike me, sitting in my little house with my basic lifestyle and amateur decorating choices. The couple from Seattle became a recurring theme over the next few days, mentioned whenever my parents wanted to illustrate how much more successfully other people managed their lives. By the end of the first week, I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical activity. The constant low-level criticism was wearing me down, each small comment adding to a growing pile of evidence that I was somehow failing at adulthood despite paying my own bills and maintaining my own home. I found myself apologizing for things that weren't problems until my parents pointed them out, and making mental lists of improvements I could make if I just worked harder and spent smarter. The worst part was how reasonable they all sounded. Of course, it made sense to upgrade my internet if I was running a business from home. Obviously, I should invest in better kitchen equipment if I was going to be cooking for guests. Naturally, I should consider their suggestions for improving my space, since they had more experience with home ownership and financial planning. Each individual request seemed logical and caring, which made my resistance feel petty and ungrateful. Brandon's presence amplified everything, adding a layer of spiritual superiority to the practical criticism. He'd started referring to my attachment to my current lifestyle as resistance to growth, and he peppered his conversations with phrases he'd learned from self-help books and meditation retreats. According to his analysis, my problem wasn't that my family was being demanding, it was that I was stuck in limiting beliefs that prevented me from accepting their help. "You have such a scarcity mindset," he told me one evening as I tried to work around his guitar equipment in the living room. You're so focused on protecting what you have that you can't see the abundance that's trying to flow into your life. Mom and Dad are offering you wisdom from their experience, and you're just blocking it. The wisdom from their experience apparently included the insight that my house would be more valuable if I invested in professional landscaping, upgraded appliances, and renovated the bathroom they'd decided was too small for modern living. Never mind that I'd specifically chosen this house because it was affordable and allowed me to live independently. According to Brandon's interpretation, my satisfaction with my current situation was actually a psychological limitation that I needed to overcome. Friday morning brought news that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at first. My mother announced over breakfast that some friends from their photography workshop wanted to see my house. "They're so interested in authentic Southwestern architecture," she explained, buttering her toast with the expensive organic butter she'd insisted I buy. "I told them about your grandmother's place and how you've been working to update it. They'd love to get some photographs of the original features." The prospect of strangers touring my home while I was trying to work made my stomach clench, but I'd already learned that objecting to my parents' plans only led to lectures about flexibility and hospitality. "When were you thinking?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be sometime that was convenient for everyone except me. "This afternoon, if that works," my father said, not really asking so much as informing me of the schedule. "We thought we could give them a quick tour, maybe take some pictures in that beautiful morning light that comes through your kitchen windows." The kitchen windows where I usually sat with my coffee and planned my day, in the one quiet hour before the rest of the house woke up and started requiring my attention. But apparently my private morning routine was less important than providing a backdrop for someone else's photography project. The friends turned out to be the couple from Seattle with the luxury RV, along with two other workshop participants who treated my house like a museum exhibit. They wandered through my rooms commenting on the charming original details and authentic lived-in feel, as if I weren't standing right there. One woman spent 10 minutes photographing my grandmother's ceramic collection, explaining to her husband how real people decorated differently than the staged homes they usually saw. I stood in my own living room feeling like a tour guide in a place where I happened to sleep, watching strangers handle my grandmother's belongings while my parents provided commentary about my decorating choices and renovation plans. "Allison's been so thoughtful about preserving the historical character," my mother said, which sounded complimentary until she added, "though there's obviously room for modernization in some areas." The woman from Seattle nodded sympathetically. "It's always such a challenge, isn't it? Balancing respect for the past with the need to make a space functional for contemporary living." She gestured toward my kitchen with its vintage appliances and hand-painted tiles. "You could do so much with this space if you opened it up more." By the time the impromptu tour ended, I felt like my house had been appraised and found wanting by a panel of experts I'd never asked for. Every room had been discussed in terms of its potential rather than its current reality, as if the way I'd chosen to live was just a placeholder until I found the time and money to do things properly. That evening, as my parents and Brandon rehashed the afternoon with enthusiasm about the connections they'd made and the photography tips they'd learned, I sat quietly in the corner of my own living room and realized something had shifted. I was no longer irritated or frustrated by their behavior. I was angry, and that anger felt clean and sharp in a way that surprised me. For 7 days, I'd bent and adjusted and accommodated, telling myself that this was what family did for each other. I'd moved my work, rearranged my furniture, changed my routines, and spent money I didn't have, all in service of making their visit more comfortable. But what had I gotten in return? Constant criticism disguised as concern, suggestions for improvement. That implied nothing I'd chosen was quite good enough, and the gradual erosion of my sense of ownership over my own space. The breaking point was still coming, but I could feel it building like a storm on the horizon. Something was going to have to give, and I was beginning to suspect it wasn't going to be me this time. Saturday night arrived with the kind of desert heat that made even the lizards seek shade, and my parents returned from their workshop day buzzing with excitement about their final project. They'd been tasked with creating a portfolio that told the story of a place, and apparently my house had been volunteered as their subject without anyone bothering to ask my permission first. "It's perfect," my mother announced as she spread her camera equipment across my dining table again. "The narrative arc of a historic home transitioning between generations. We can capture the tension between preservation and progress." The way she described my house as a transition between generations made it sound temporary, like I was just keeping the place warm until someone more qualified came along to do something meaningful with it. But what bothered me more was the assumption that my life was available for their artistic interpretation, that my daily routines and personal spaces could be repurposed as raw material for their creative project. "We'll need to stage some shots tomorrow morning," my father added, consulting a notebook where he'd apparently been planning this photography session for days. "Patricia thinks we should capture you in natural moments around the house. Maybe making coffee in the kitchen, or working in the garden. Natural moments that would be completely artificial, performed for their cameras while they directed me to move and pose and interact with my own belongings like props in their story." I opened my mouth to object, but Brandon jumped in with his own contribution to the family art project. "I could play guitar in the background," he suggested enthusiastically. "It would add this authentic creative energy to the shots. Like, showing how the house inspires artistic expression across generations." The house that inspired artistic expression was the same house where I'd been unable to work for a week because of his guitar playing and equipment taking over my workspace. But Brandon's revisionist history turned his disruption of my routine into evidence of the house's creative influence. According to his interpretation, my frustration with being unable to use my own living room was actually ingratitude for the artistic atmosphere he was providing. I excused myself and went to bed early, lying awake in the dark while I listened to my family plan tomorrow's photography session through the thin walls. They discussed lighting and composition and narrative themes, treating my home and my life like raw material they could shape into whatever story they wanted to tell. The conversation went on for hours, punctuated by the sound of furniture being moved around as they tested different arrangements for their shots. Sunday morning, I woke up to find that my living room had been completely rearranged without my consent or input. My couch had been angled toward the window to catch better light. My grandmother's writing desk had been moved back to center stage. But now it was decorated with props that weren't mine, fresh flowers in a vase I'd never seen, books arranged in artful stacks, a vintage camera that belonged to my father positioned as if my grandmother had been a photography enthusiast. "Doesn't this look wonderful?" my mother asked when she saw me staring at the staged scene. "We're telling the story of creative women across generations. Your grandmother with her letters, you with your design work, all connected by this beautiful space." The beautiful space that no longer looked like my living room, furnished with objects that weren't mine and arranged according to someone else's aesthetic vision. My grandmother's desk, which I'd kept exactly as she'd left it as a way of honoring her memory, had been turned into a movie set. The fountain pen she'd used for 40 years was gone, replaced by my father's vintage camera that told a completely different story about who she'd been and what had mattered to her. "Where's Grandma's pen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. My mother waved dismissively toward the kitchen. "Oh, that old thing was cluttering up the composition. We needed clean lines for the camera. You can put it back later." That old thing was a Parker 51 that my grandmother had received as a high school graduation gift in 1952. She'd written thousands of letters with it, including the ones she'd sent me during college that had kept me connected to family when I felt most alone. But in my mother's artistic vision, my grandmother's actual possessions were clutter that interfered with the story they wanted to tell about creative women and beautiful spaces. The photography session lasted 3 hours, during which I was directed to move through my own house like an actress playing the role of myself. Sit at the desk and pretend to write. Stand by the kitchen window and look thoughtful. Walk through the garden touching plants while appearing contemplative about nature and growth. Every genuine moment was interrupted by instructions to adjust my posture, change my expression, or interact with objects in ways that looked more natural for the camera. "Try to look like you're really connecting with the space," my father instructed as I stood awkwardly by my own bookshelf. "Like you're discovering something meaningful about your grandmother's legacy." My grandmother's legacy was being rewritten in real time, transformed from the actual woman who'd raised tomatoes and hosted neighborhood potlucks into some kind of artistic spirit who'd left behind a house full of creative inspiration. The reality of who she'd been, practical, generous, proud of her small home and simple pleasures, didn't fit the narrative my parents wanted to create, so it was edited out in favor of something more photogenic. Brandon provided musical accompaniment that was supposed to represent the creative energy flowing through the space, though it mostly just made it impossible for me to think clearly while posing for pictures in my own living room. Between songs, he offered commentary about the beautiful energy being captured and how meaningful it was to document our family's artistic evolution. By the time they finished shooting, I felt like I'd been hollowed out and filled with someone else's version of my life. Every room in my house had been rearranged according to their aesthetic preferences, every personal possession had been evaluated for its photographic potential, and every aspect of my relationship with my grandmother's memory had been reinterpreted to serve their artistic vision. "This is going to be such a powerful portfolio," my mother said as she packed up her camera equipment. "The judges are going to love this narrative about women and creativity and family heritage." The family heritage that had been completely fabricated for the purposes of their photography contest, bearing no resemblance to the actual people and relationships and choices that had shaped this house and my life in it. But pointing that out would make me the ungrateful granddaughter who didn't appreciate their efforts to honor my grandmother's memory, even though their idea of honoring her involved erasing everything that had actually made her who she was. That afternoon, while my parents processed their photographs and planned their presentation, I walked through my house trying to recognize it as the place where I lived. Every room felt like a stage set that had been struck after the performance, leaving behind furniture arrangements that looked good in pictures but made no sense for daily life. My grandmother's desk sat in artificial perfection, decorated with objects that told someone else's story about who she'd been and what she'd valued. I found her fountain pen on the kitchen counter where it had been discarded like the clutter my mother considered it to be. As I held it, I could almost hear my grandmother's voice reminding me that this house was mine now, that I had the right to fill it with my own life and my own choices. She'd left it to me not because she thought I needed fixing, but because she'd trusted me to love it as much as she had. That trust felt sacred in a way that had nothing to do with photography contests or artistic narratives about creative women. It was about the simple reality of making a home, of choosing to build a life in a place that mattered to you, of respecting the people who'd come before you while still making space for your own dreams and preferences. As I put the pen back in its proper place in the desk drawer, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. I was done accommodating other people's visions for my life. I was done pretending that their improvements were gifts instead of criticisms. I was done being grateful for advice I hadn't asked for and help that made everything harder. Monday morning would bring the second week of their visit, and Brandon's departure back to Denver. But it would also bring something else, the beginning of the end of my willingness to be treated like a supporting character in my own story. The shift started small, almost invisible. Monday morning, instead of apologizing for the coffee that wasn't strong enough or the shower pressure that wasn't quite right, I simply listened to their complaints without rushing to fix problems that weren't actually problems. When my mother suggested that I should really consider professional housekeeping services since maintaining this place was clearly overwhelming for one person, I just said, "I'll think about it," instead of explaining that I actually enjoyed taking care of my own home. When Brandon packed his bags that afternoon, preparing to return to Denver and his next spiritual adventure, he gave me one of his meaningful hugs and shared some parting wisdom about growth and change. "I can really see you evolving during this visit," he told me seriously. "Like, you're starting to understand what this place could become instead of just accepting what it is." What it was happened to be exactly what I wanted it to be, but I'd learned that contradicting Brandon's insights only led to longer conversations about my resistance to positive change. So I just smiled and thanked him for sharing his perspective, then watched him load his guitar and meditation equipment into the rental car without offering to help. After he left, the house felt different. Quieter, but also somehow larger, as if the removal of one person had created space for the rest of us to spread out and breathe. My parents seemed to relax too, settling into what felt like a more manageable routine now that they weren't performing their parenting wisdom for Brandon's benefit. But the calm was deceptive. Tuesday brought a conversation that would change everything, though it started innocuously enough with my mother asking about my plans for the rest of the week. "We were thinking it might be nice to have a few more people over before we leave," she said casually while rearranging the living room furniture that I'd moved back to its original positions. "Some of the people from the workshop have been so interested in seeing more of the house. More people touring my home like it was a public attraction rather than a private residence. More strangers handling my grandmother's belongings and offering opinions about my decorating choices. More hours of playing host in my own space while other people decided what they thought about my life and my choices. I'd rather keep things quiet for the rest of your visit," I said, trying to sound diplomatic. "I have some big projects due this week, and I really need to focus on work." My mother's face went through several expressions before settling on disappointed understanding. "Of course," she said in the tone that meant the opposite. "We certainly don't want to interfere with your business obligations." The way she said business obligations, made my freelance work sound like a hobby I was taking too seriously, rather than the career that paid for the house they'd been criticizing all week. But I'd learned to recognize the passive-aggressive disappointment that was designed to make me change my mind and accommodate whatever they'd already planned without consulting me. Actually, my father said, emerging from the guest room with a stack of printed photographs, we've already mentioned to a few people that they could stop by Thursday evening. Just a small gathering, very casual. It would be such a shame to disappoint them now. They'd already made plans. Again. Without asking me, without considering my schedule or preferences, without acknowledging that this was my home and I might have some say in who got invited into it. The casualness of the announcement made it clear they expected me to go along with whatever they'd arranged, just like I'd been going along with everything else for the past week and a half. I'm not comfortable with that, I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth. For almost 2 weeks, I'd been agreeing and accommodating and adjusting, making myself smaller so they could be more comfortable. But something about the way they'd simply decided to use my home for their social event without consulting me had finally pushed me past my limit. The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear the air conditioning cycling on, the sound somehow amplified in the sudden quiet. My parents exchanged a look that I recognized from childhood, the kind of wordless communication that happened when they needed to present a united front against my unreasonable behavior. Allison, my mother said in her most patient voice, we're not asking you to host a party. It's just a few friends stopping by to see the house. You don't need to do anything except be gracious. Be gracious while strangers wandered through my home taking pictures and offering commentary about my life choices. Be gracious while my parents showed off my space like it was their discovery rather than my daily reality. Be gracious while I tried to work around yet another disruption to my routine and my space and my sense of privacy in my own home. The answer is no, I said, and this time the words felt solid and final. I don't want strangers in my house, and I need this week to catch up on work that I've been unable to do while you've been visiting. My father's eyebrows went up in the expression he'd always used when I was being unreasonably difficult as a child. That seems rather inhospitable, he said mildly. These are nice people who've been genuinely interested in the house and your grandmother's history. I think she would have wanted you to share her legacy with others. The invocation of my grandmother's wishes was the final straw. My grandmother, who'd been intensely private about her home and had never invited anyone over unless she genuinely wanted their company. My grandmother, who'd left me this house specifically because she trusted me to make my own decisions about how to live in it. My grandmother, who would have been appalled at the idea of using her memory to manipulate me into hosting people I didn't want to see. Grandma would have wanted me to make my own choices about my own home, I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. And my choice is no visitors Thursday night. The room went very still. My parents weren't used to direct opposition from me, and they clearly didn't know how to respond to this unfamiliar version of their accommodating daughter. I could see them recalibrating, trying to figure out which approach would be most effective in getting me back in line. Well, my mother said finally, her voice tight with controlled disappointment, I suppose we'll have to make some embarrassing phone calls and cancel plans that people were looking forward to. The guilt trip was expertly designed to make me feel responsible for their social embarrassment rather than holding them accountable for making plans in my home without my permission. But for the first time in 2 weeks, the guilt bounced off me instead of sinking in. I wasn't responsible for fixing problems they'd created by overstepping boundaries I should have established much earlier. I'm sorry you'll have to make those calls, I said, and I meant it. But I didn't agree to host anyone, and I can't accommodate guests right now. What happened next would later seem like the inevitable result of 2 weeks of accumulated tension, but in the moment it felt shocking and sudden. My father set down his photographs and looked at me with the kind of disappointment usually reserved for major life failures. Allison, he said in the voice he'd used when I was 16 and had missed curfew, I think you need to take a step back and consider whether you're being the person your grandmother raised you to be. The person my grandmother raised me to be was exactly who I was in that moment, someone who stood up for herself, who made her own decisions, who didn't sacrifice her own well-being to make other people comfortable. But my parents had never seen that side of my grandmother, because she'd spent their visits being the perfect hostess who never complained or set inconvenient boundaries. I think I am, I said quietly. I think she'd be proud of me for speaking up for myself. That's when my mother delivered the blow that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. If this is how you're going to treat family who've come all this way to spend time with you, she said, her voice cold with controlled anger, then maybe you need some time to think about what's really important to you. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Shape up, start accommodating our wishes again, or face the consequences of being cut off from family relationships. It was the same ultimatum they'd used throughout my childhood whenever I'd pushed back against their expectations or asserted my own preferences. Usually, it worked. But something had changed during these 2 weeks of watching them criticize and rearrange and take over my space. Something about the way they'd treated my home and my grandmother's memory and my own choices had finally made me understand that their love came with conditions I could never fully meet. There would always be something else I needed to improve, some other way I was falling short of their expectations, some other sacrifice I needed to make to prove I was worthy of their approval. Maybe I do need some time to think, I said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff. Maybe you should consider cutting your visit short. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in our conversation. This wasn't shock or recalibration, this was the moment when everyone realized we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. My parents stared at me like I'd become a stranger, which in a way I had. The daughter who'd spent 2 weeks accommodating their every wish had been replaced by someone who was willing to choose her own peace over their approval. Fine, my mother said finally, her voice brittle with hurt and anger. If that's how you feel, we'll make arrangements to leave early. But even then, I don't think any of us realized how early was going to be, or what would happen in the hours between that conversation and their departure. The real confrontation was still coming, and it would happen in the place where I'd never imagined I'd have to sleep in my own home. Wednesday morning arrived with an atmosphere so thick with tension that even the desert air felt suffocating. I woke up to the sound of suitcases being dragged across the hardwood floors, followed by my mother's voice speaking in clipped, efficient tones as she made phone calls to rearrange their travel plans. The cheerful family visit facade had completely evaporated, replaced by the cold efficiency of people preparing to leave a situation that had become intolerable for everyone involved. I stayed in my bedroom longer than usual, not wanting to face the aftermath of Tuesday night's confrontation. Through the thin walls, I could hear my parents moving around with the kind of deliberate noise that was meant to communicate their displeasure without requiring actual conversation. Drawers slammed shut with more force than necessary. Footsteps struck the floor with pointed emphasis. Even the coffee maker seemed to gurgle with accusatory undertones as my father prepared his morning caffeine with obvious irritation. When I finally emerged, I found my parents engaged in the kind of passive-aggressive packing that was designed to make me feel guilty for disrupting their vacation plans. My mother was carefully folding clothes with sharp, precise movements that spoke of barely controlled anger. My father was dismantling his photography equipment with theatrical sighs that suggested he was being forced to abandon some crucial artistic endeavor due to my unreasonable behavior. "Good morning," I said, trying to inject some normalcy into the frigid atmosphere. My mother looked up from her suitcase with the kind of smile that was more frightening than an outright frown. "Good morning, dear," she replied in a voice that could have frozen the swimming pools in Scottsdale. "We've decided to leave this afternoon instead of Friday. We don't want to impose on your busy schedule any longer than necessary." The word impose was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability about its intended cruelty. After all, she was just being considerate of my work commitments, even though we all knew the real reason for their early departure had nothing to do with my professional obligations and everything to do with my refusal to continue accommodating their social plans. "I'm sorry it's come to this," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I meant it. Part of me was relieved that the constant tension would end sooner than expected, even if it meant dealing with the immediate fallout of having disappointed them so thoroughly. My father glanced up from coiling camera cables with unnecessary precision. "Are you?" he asked mildly. "Because it seems like this is exactly what you wanted. Complete control over your space without any consideration for family relationships." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to make me doubt myself. I did want control over my own space, what reasonable person wouldn't? But the way he framed it made my desire for basic autonomy in my own home sound selfish and antisocial, as if wanting to make decisions about my own life was evidence of some fundamental character flaw. "I just wanted to be consulted about plans. That affected my home and my schedule," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "That doesn't seem unreasonable to me." My mother made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any humor. "Consulted," she repeated, as if the word itself was evidence of my inflated sense of importance. "When did family visits become business negotiations?" The question was rhetorical, designed to make me feel like I was treating family relationships with inappropriate formality. But what she was really asking was when I'd stopped being the accommodating daughter who said yes to everything and started having opinions about how my own life should be organized. The answer was sometime during the past 2 weeks, though I was only beginning to understand the full implications of that transformation. The day continued in this vein, with every interaction weighted down by unspoken recriminations and disappointed expectations. My parents packed with the methodical thoroughness of people who wanted to make sure they weren't leaving anything behind that might require future contact. They stripped the guest room of every trace of their presence, even taking the towels to the laundry room as if they were erasing evidence of their visit rather than simply cleaning up after themselves. I tried to work in my makeshift office corner, but concentration was impossible with the atmosphere of injured dignity that permeated every room. My parents moved through the house like ghosts of family relationships past, visible but not quite present, there but not really engaged with anything except the logistics of their departure. Every few minutes, one of them would remember something else that needed to be packed or cleaned or arranged, providing opportunities for meaningful sighs and pointed comments about the disruption to their carefully planned photography workshop experience. Around noon, my mother emerged from the guest room with a stack of the linens she'd insisted on washing. "I've put fresh sheets on the bed," she announced, as if this act of basic courtesy was going above and beyond what the situation required. "Even though you made it clear that hospitality isn't something you value." The comment was perfectly crafted to make me feel simultaneously grateful for her consideration and guilty for apparently not appreciating it sufficiently. This was my mother's specialty, performing acts of service while simultaneously making it clear that the recipient didn't deserve such generosity. It was emotional manipulation disguised as kindness, and I'd been falling for it my entire life. "Thank you," I said simply, refusing to take the bait that would lead to another conversation about my apparent ingratitude and selfishness. But my restraint only seemed to fuel her frustration with my new unwillingness to engage in the familiar dance of accusation and defense that had characterized our relationship for as long as I could remember. She clearly wanted me to argue with her, to give her an opening to explain everything that was wrong with my attitude and my choices and my failure to appreciate the family I'd been blessed with. My refusal to participate in that dynamic left her with nowhere to direct her anger except into increasingly elaborate displays of wounded dignity. By mid-afternoon, their departure preparations had taken on an almost ceremonial quality. My father made multiple trips to the car, carrying bags and equipment with the kind of exaggerated care that suggested he was moving precious artifacts that might be damaged by rough handling. My mother double-checked every surface in the guest room, as if she was conducting a final inspection to ensure that their presence could be completely erased from my ungrateful home. I found myself watching this performance with a mixture of sadness and relief, understanding that something fundamental in our family relationships had shifted during this visit and would probably never return to its previous state. The comfortable fiction that we were a close, loving family who enjoyed spending time together had been stripped away, leaving behind the uncomfortable reality that we were people who didn't actually like each other very much but felt obligated to maintain connections based on shared genetics rather than genuine affection. The breaking point came around 4 o'clock, when my father announced that their flight had been rescheduled for early Thursday morning rather than Wednesday evening. The airline couldn't accommodate the change on such short notice, he explained, with the kind of weary resignation that suggested this inconvenience was just another consequence of my unreasonable behavior. "We'll have to stay one more night." One more night of the frigid politeness and pointed silences that had characterized the day. One more evening of careful conversations that avoided any topic that might lead to acknowledgement of the fundamental disagreement that had precipitated their early departure. One more morning of awkward goodbyes and the pretense that this visit had been anything other than a complete disaster for everyone involved. "Of course," I said, because what else could I say? They needed somewhere to sleep, and despite everything that had happened, they were still my parents. "The guest room is ready whenever you need it." But that's when my mother delivered the statement that would transform the entire situation. From uncomfortable family drama into something much more serious. "Actually," she said with the kind of casual cruelty that takes years of practice to perfect, "we've decided we'd prefer to sleep somewhere with a little more space. The guest room is rather cramped for 2 people and all our equipment." The guest room that had been perfectly adequate for the previous 10 days suddenly wasn't suitable for one final night. The guest room where they'd been comfortable enough to spread out their belongings and rearrange my furniture and make themselves thoroughly at home was now too small for their needs. I waited for the alternative suggestion, though some part of me already knew what was coming. "We thought we'd set up in the garage," my father added with studied casualness. "It's larger, and we can organize our photography equipment without feeling crowded. You don't mind, do you?" They wanted to sleep in the garage. The garage where I parked my car, stored my tools, and kept the boxes of Christmas decorations and old college textbooks that every homeowner accumulates over time. The garage with concrete floors and minimal climate control, where the temperature fluctuated with the desert extremes and the only seating was a couple of folding chairs I used when I needed to work on projects that required more space than my kitchen table could provide. "You want to sleep in the garage?" I repeated, trying to make sure I'd understood correctly. My mother's expression was a masterpiece of innocent confusion, as if my surprise was evidence of some failure of imagination. On my part. It's not like we're asking to sleep on the street, she said reasonably. Garages can be quite comfortable if they're set up properly. And it would give us more room to organize our things for the flight tomorrow. The reasonableness of her tone made my objection feel petty and small, which was exactly what it was designed to do. After all, what was the big deal about sleeping in a garage for one night? People camped in tents, slept in their cars during road trips, made do with all kinds of less than ideal accommodations when necessary. Surely I could be flexible enough to let my parents use my garage for a few hours of sleep before their early morning departure. But something about the request felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with comfort or practicality. This wasn't about needing more space for their belongings or preferring the layout of the garage to the guest room. This was about making a statement, about demonstrating that they'd rather sleep in a storage area than spend one more night in my inadequate home accepting my inadequate hospitality. I don't think the garage is appropriate for sleeping, I said carefully. It's not insulated, there's no proper heating or cooling, and it's not set up for overnight guests. My father waved away my concerns with the kind of dismissive gesture that suggested I was overthinking a simple situation. We've slept in much worse conditions during photography expeditions, he said. Remember that cabin in Montana with no running water? This will be luxury compared to some of the places we've stayed. The comparison to their adventure travel accommodations was meant to make me feel like I was fussing over nothing, but it also revealed something important about how they viewed this situation. They weren't asking to use my garage because it was a reasonable alternative to the guest room. They were choosing to sleep in my garage because it allowed them to frame themselves as hardy travelers making do with primitive conditions, rather than family members who'd been welcomed into a comfortable home and then decided it wasn't good enough for their needs. The guest room is available, I said firmly. You're welcome to stay there, just like you have been for the past 10 days. That's when the mask finally slipped completely, and I saw the cold calculation that had been driving this entire conversation. My mother's expression hardened into something that was honest in its cruelty. The guest room that you so grudgingly provided, she said. The space you made it clear we were imposing on? I think we'd prefer to maintain our independence for our last night here. Independence. As if choosing to sleep in my garage was some kind of statement about self-sufficiency rather than an elaborate punishment designed to make me feel guilty for having established boundaries they didn't like. As if their discomfort would somehow prove a point about my failure as a daughter and a hostess. But I was done trying to decode the hidden messages and implied criticisms. I was done accepting responsibility for their emotional reactions to my perfectly reasonable decisions about my own life. If they wanted to sleep in my garage to prove some point about my inadequacy, that was their choice to make. Fine, I said. If that's what you prefer, the garage is yours for the night. The look of surprise that flashed across both their faces told me they hadn't expected me to agree so readily. They'd been counting on me to argue, to insist that they take the guest room, to demonstrate the proper level of concern for their comfort that would prove I was still the accommodating daughter they'd always been able to manipulate. My calm acceptance of their garage sleeping plan disrupted their script and left them momentarily unsure how to proceed. But they recovered quickly, slipping back into the role of long-suffering parents making the best of their difficult daughters. In hospitality. We'll need some basic supplies, my mother said with the kind of resigned practicality that suggested she was already mentally composing the story she'd tell her friends about this experience. Blankets, pillows, perhaps something to make the floor more comfortable. Of course they'd need supplies. Of course their choice to sleep in the garage would require me to provide additional accommodations that I hadn't planned for and didn't have readily available. The reasonable thing would have been for me to suggest that if they needed blankets and pillows and floor padding, they might want to reconsider their decision to abandon the perfectly comfortable guest room in favor of concrete floors and inadequate climate control. Instead, I heard myself saying, I'll see what I can find, because even in the midst of this elaborate punishment disguised as practical necessity, I couldn't quite bring myself to let my parents sleep on bare concrete without any cushioning or warmth. I spent the next hour gathering supplies that would make garage sleeping marginally more tolerable. I found some old sleeping bags in my closet, along with the foam camping mats I'd used during a brief hiking phase in college. I dragged out the space heater I occasionally used in my office during particularly cold desert nights. I even provided extra blankets and the good pillows from my own bed, because some part of me still couldn't accept that my parents had chosen garage sleeping as their preferred way to spend their final night in my home. As I arranged their improvised bedroom in the space between my car and the storage shelves, I kept waiting for one of them to acknowledge how ridiculous this situation had become. Surely my mother would realize that sleeping on concrete was an overreaction to a disagreement about social visits. Surely my father would recognize that choosing the garage over a comfortable guest room was cutting off their noses to spite their faces. But they approached their garage camping experience with the kind of determined martyrdom that suggested this was exactly the outcome they'd been working toward. They arranged their sleeping bags with military precision, organized their remaining belongings along the walls, and tested the space heater with the thoroughness of people settling in for an extended camping trip rather than one night of self-imposed discomfort. "This will be fine," my mother announced with satisfaction, as if she'd successfully solved a complex logistical problem rather than created an entirely unnecessary hardship for herself. "Actually, it reminds me of when your father and I were young and went camping in national parks. There's something authentically Western about sleeping in a garage in Arizona." The romanticization of their garage sleeping experience was the final touch in what had become an elaborate performance designed to highlight my failures as a daughter and a hostess. They weren't just choosing to sleep in uncomfortable conditions, they were choosing to find those conditions meaningful and character-building, as if my inability to provide them with accommodations they found sufficiently welcoming had forced them to rediscover their adventurous spirits. I stood in my garage watching my parents prepare for their night of voluntary martyrdom, and I realized that this moment would define our relationship going forward. They had chosen to sleep on concrete floors rather than accept hospitality that came with boundaries they didn't like. They had turned their final night in my home into a statement about my inadequacy rather than an opportunity to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship over the past 2 weeks. "Well," I said finally, "I hope you're comfortable. Let me know if you need anything else." As I walked back into my house, leaving them to their garage sleeping arrangements, I felt something settle into place that hadn't been there before. A kind of clarity about who my parents actually were and what they were actually willing to do to maintain their sense of superiority over my life choices. They had chosen symbolic discomfort over genuine connection, performance over relationship, proving a point over finding common ground. I went to bed that night listening to the muffled sounds of my parents settling into their garage accommodations, and I understood that when they left in the morning, something fundamental would have changed between us forever. But what I didn't yet realize was that their garage sleeping performance was about to backfire in ways they hadn't anticipated, and that their attempt to punish me for setting boundaries was going to provide me with the perfect opportunity to set some much more permanent ones. The sounds from the garage continued well into the night, not distress or discomfort, but the kind of deliberate noise that suggested they wanted me to be aware of their sacrifice. Occasional conversations and voices just loud enough to carry through the thin garage door. The scraping of equipment being moved around. The testing and retesting of the space heater that I'd provided for their comfort. By midnight, I realized they weren't just sleeping in my garage, they were performing garage sleeping for my benefit, making sure I was fully aware of the lengths they'd been driven to by my unreasonable insistence on being consulted about plans that affected my own home. It was the final act in a 2-week performance designed to teach me a lesson about the consequences of prioritizing my own needs over their preferences. But as I lay in my own bed, listening to their theatrical suffering echoing through the walls, I began to understand that they had just provided me with something valuable, absolute clarity about who they were and what they thought of me. And more importantly, they had given me the perfect justification for what I was going to do in the morning. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to accommodate their needs while maintaining basic boundaries. I had offered them comfortable guest room accommodations right up until the moment they decided that sleeping in my garage was preferable to accepting hospitality that came with the expectation of basic respect for my autonomy. They had made their choice. Now I was going to make mine. I spent the dark hours before dawn planning exactly how the morning was going to unfold, and by the time the sun started to rise over the Arizona mountains, I was ready to give my parents the independence they claimed to want so badly. They were about to discover that garage sleeping had been the least of their problems, and that their performance of martyred inconvenience was going to cost them much more than one uncomfortable night on concrete floors. The lesson they'd been trying to teach me about gratitude and accommodation was about to be overwhelmed by the lesson I was going to teach them about consequences and boundaries. And unlike their garage sleeping theater, my lesson was going to have permanent results that would extend far beyond their planned departure time. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 5:30 in the morning, though I'd been awake for over an hour already, staring at the ceiling while my mind raced through the conversation I was about to have. Outside, the desert was still dark, that deep purple darkness that comes just before dawn when the heat hasn't yet built up and the air still holds a hint of coolness that will disappear within minutes of sunrise. I could hear my parents stirring in the garage, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they discussed their early morning flight and the logistics of getting to the airport. There was something almost cheerful in their tone, as if their night of garage sleeping had reinvigorated them, proven some point about their resilience and my inadequacy that made them feel victorious despite their self-imposed discomfort. I dressed carefully in clothes that would photograph well if this morning went the way I expected it to. Not that I was planning to document anything, but I'd learned enough about my family's tendency towards social media documentation of their experiences to know that nothing stayed private for long. If today was going to be the end of something, I wanted to look like someone who was in control of her own life and decisions. The first step was a phone call I'd been putting off for months, partly because I hadn't been sure I needed to take such a drastic step and partly because I hadn't wanted to admit that my relationship with my parents had deteriorated to the point where legal boundaries might become necessary. But their garage sleeping performance had clarified something important. They were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to prove points about my inadequacy, and I needed to be prepared for whatever escalation might come next. Kevin Martinez answered his phone on the second ring, despite the early hour. As a paralegal specializing in family law and property disputes, he was used to calls that couldn't wait for business hours. We'd met through a neighborhood association meeting where he'd given a presentation about property rights and tenant law, and I'd kept his card in my wallet ever since, hoping I'd never need to use it. "Kevin, it's Allison Harper," I said quietly, keeping my voice low so it wouldn't carry to the garage. "I know it's early, but I have a situation that's escalating quickly and I need some advice about property rights and family members who refuse to leave." There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of coffee being poured in the background. "Are we talking about elderly parents who need care, or something else?" he asked, his voice professional but warm. "Something else," I said. "My parents have been staying with me for almost 2 weeks, and what started as a family visit has turned into them treating my home like their personal vacation rental. They've ignored my requests to respect my workspace, they've rearranged my furniture without permission, they've made social plans in my house without consulting me, and when I finally set some boundaries, they decided to sleep in my garage last night to prove a point about how unwelcoming I am." Kevin was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him shifting into legal mode. "Garage sleeping by choice, not because you made them?" he asked. "Completely by choice," I confirmed. "I offered them the guest room they'd been using all week, but they decided the garage would demonstrate their independence more effectively." "Okay," he said slowly. "And what are you hoping to accomplish this morning?" That was the question I'd been wrestling with all night. What did I want to accomplish? Did I want to repair our relationship, salvage what was left of family harmony, find some way to move forward that preserved everyone's dignity? Or did I want something more final, something that would establish boundaries so clear that this kind of manipulation could never happen again? "I want them to understand that they can't use emotional manipulation to override my decisions about my own home," I said. "And I want legal backing if they decide to escalate this further." Kevin was quiet for another moment. "Arizona law is pretty clear about property owners' rights to control who stays on their property and under what conditions," he said finally. "Even family members don't have automatic rights to remain in your home if you've asked them to leave. Do you want me to draft something formal?" The word formal hung in the air between us, carrying implications that felt both terrifying and liberating. A formal document would make this real, would transform a family disagreement into a legal matter with consequences that extended beyond hurt feelings and damaged relationships. "Yes," I said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff. "I want something in writing that makes it clear they need to leave today and can't return without invitation." "I can have a cease and desist letter ready within the hour," Kevin said. "It'll establish that they're no longer welcome on your property, and that any future contact needs to be arranged through legal channels." "Are you sure you want to go that route?" Was I sure? 2 weeks ago, the idea of serving my parents with legal papers would have seemed insane, like something that happened in other families with serious dysfunction, not in normal families with typical disagreements about boundaries and respect. But somewhere during their garage sleeping performance, I'd realized that this wasn't a normal family disagreement. This was a pattern of manipulation and control that had been escalating for years, and unless I did something decisive to interrupt that pattern, it was only going to get worse. "I'm sure," I said. "Can you bring it to my house?" "I have a feeling this conversation is going to require witnesses." Kevin agreed to meet me at 7 o'clock, which would give me time to prepare the conversation I needed to have with my parents before he arrived. I spent the next hour rehearsing what I was going to say, practicing different responses to the arguments and guilt trips I knew they'd deploy, trying to anticipate every possible way they might try to turn this situation around and make me the unreasonable one. At 6:30, I heard them moving around more purposefully in the garage, the sounds of people packing up their temporary campsite and preparing for departure. Part of me hoped that would be the end of it, that they'd simply leave for the airport. And we could all pretend that the garage sleeping incident had been an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than the culmination of 2 weeks of systematic boundary violations. But that hope died when I heard my mother's voice carrying clearly through the garage door, apparently talking to someone on the phone about their experience. "You wouldn't believe the conditions we've been subjected to," she was saying in the martyred tone she used when she wanted sympathy for her suffering. "Sleeping on concrete floors because the guest accommodations weren't suitable for people with any kind of standards. The guest accommodations that had been perfectly suitable. For 10 days until they decided to punish me for not accommodating their social plans. The concrete floors they'd chosen over a comfortable bed because sleeping in my garage made a better statement about my failures as a hostess. But in my mother's retelling, their discomfort became evidence of my inadequacy rather than their deliberate choice. I just don't understand how she turned out so selfish," my mother continued, apparently unaware that her voice was carrying into the house. "After everything we've done for her, all the support we've provided over the years, and this is how she treats family who come to visit." The support they provided over the years consisted mainly of criticism disguised as concern and suggestions for improvement that implied I was constantly failing to meet their standards. But in my mother's version of our family history, they were the generous parents who'd been repaid with ingratitude and hostility from their difficult daughter. I listened to her rewrite the events of the past 2 weeks for her audience, transforming their systematic takeover of my space into loving attempts to help me improve my living situation, their criticism of my choices into caring guidance from experienced adults, their social plans made without my consent into reasonable expectations of family hospitality. Every boundary I'd tried to set became evidence of my selfishness. Every attempt to maintain autonomy in my own home became proof of my inability to appreciate the family I'd been blessed with. By the time Kevin arrived at 7 o'clock sharp, I was ready for whatever manipulation tactics my parents were planning to deploy. He was exactly what I'd expected from our brief previous meeting: professional, calm, and completely unimpressed by family drama. He carried a leather folder that contained the legal documents that would transform this morning from a family argument into something with real consequences. "The cease and desist letter establishes that they're trespassing if they remain on your property after being served," he explained as we stood in my kitchen, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to the garage. "It also prohibits them from returning without written invitation and creates a legal paper trail if you need to involve law enforcement later." Law enforcement. The phrase made everything feel suddenly serious in a way that family arguments never did. This wasn't about hurt feelings or damaged relationships anymore. This was about establishing legal boundaries that would be enforced by people with badges and handcuffs if necessary. "What happens if they refuse to leave?" I asked. "Then it becomes trespassing, and you call the police," Kevin said matter-of-factly. "Property law doesn't make exceptions for family relationships. Your house, your rules, your right to decide who stays and who goes." The simplicity of it was almost shocking. For my entire adult life, I'd been conditioned to believe that family relationships were more important than personal boundaries, that keeping the peace was more valuable than protecting my own interests, that being the bigger person meant accepting treatment I would never tolerate from strangers. But the law didn't recognize any of those family obligation exceptions. Property rights were property rights, regardless of genetics or shared history. At 7:15, I walked out to the garage and knocked on the door that led from my kitchen to the space where my parents had spent the night proving points about my inadequacy. "Good morning," I called. "I need to talk to you both before you leave for the airport." The sounds of packing stopped, and I heard my parents exchange the kind of wordless communication that comes from decades of marriage and shared strategies for dealing with difficult people. The garage door opened to reveal them standing among their neatly organized luggage, looking like refugees from a disaster they'd survived through superior character and resourcefulness. "Allison," my mother said with the kind of bright cheerfulness that was designed to make me feel guilty for whatever unpleasantness I was about to introduce into their morning. "We were just finishing up here. Thank you for the use of your garage. It was actually quite comfortable once we got organized." The performance continued even in private, the insistence that their choice to sleep on concrete had been a positive experience rather than an elaborate punishment designed to make me feel bad about setting boundaries. But I was done playing along with their reframing of reality. "I'm glad you were comfortable," I said evenly. "But we need to discuss what happened yesterday and what's going to happen going forward." My father looked up from securing the straps on his camera bag, his expression shifting into the patient disappointment he used when he was preparing to explain why I was being unreasonable. "Allison, if this is about the party you didn't want us to host, we've already canceled those plans. There's no need to rehash disagreements when we're leaving in a few hours anyway." The party I didn't want them to host in my house without my permission, using my space for their social events while treating me like an obstacle to their vacation plans. But in my father's version, the problem wasn't their assumption that they could make plans in my home without consulting me, the problem was my unwillingness to accommodate their reasonable social expectations. This isn't about the party, I said. This is about the pattern of behavior that led to you choosing to sleep in my garage instead of accepting guest room accommodations that came with basic expectations of respect for my space and my autonomy. My mother's carefully maintained cheerfulness faltered slightly, replaced by the wounded confusion she used when she wanted to make me feel guilty for pointing out uncomfortable truths. Allison, I don't understand why you're being so hostile. We came here to spend time with you, and yes, there were some misunderstandings, but that's normal when people with different lifestyles try to share space. Different lifestyles. As if my preference for being consulted about plans that affected my own home was some kind of quirky lifestyle choice rather than a basic expectation of respect from people who were supposed to care about my well-being. As if they're systematic. Criticism of my choices and takeover of my space was just a natural result of different approaches to living rather than a deliberate pattern of dominance and control. The misunderstandings weren't about lifestyle differences, I said. They were about you treating my home like your vacation rental and me like staff whose job was to accommodate your preferences without question. That's when Kevin stepped out of the kitchen, folder in hand, looking exactly like what he was, a legal professional prepared to make this conversation official. My parents' expressions shifted immediately from wounded confusion to sharp alertness, the kind of attention people pay when they realize that a situation has moved beyond family drama into territory with actual consequences. Mrs. and Mr. Harper, Kevin said with professional courtesy, I'm Kevin Martinez, a paralegal representing your daughter in matters related to property rights and residential tenancy. I have some documents that need to be served before you leave. The premises this morning. The silence that followed was unlike anything that had occurred during the previous 2 weeks of tension and arguments. This wasn't the pause of people processing emotional manipulation or deciding how to respond to guilt trips. This was the silence of people realizing that they'd miscalculated badly, that their punishment sleeping in my garage had backfired in ways they hadn't anticipated. My mother found her voice first. Legal documents, she repeated, as if the words were in a foreign language she was struggling to translate. Allison, what is this about? This is about establishing clear boundaries. That apparently can't be maintained through normal family communication, I said. Since sleeping in my garage was preferable to accepting guest room accommodations that came with basic expectations of respect, I've decided that you need legal clarification about your status on my property. Kevin opened his folder and removed 2 identical sets of papers, offering one to each of my parents with the kind of professional neutrality that made it clear this was business, not personal drama. These documents establish that you're no longer welcome on this property without written invitation from the owner, he said. They also create a legal record that you've been asked to leave and cannot return without permission. My father took his copy with hands that weren't quite steady, scanning the official letterhead and legal language that transformed their garage sleeping performance into evidence of unwelcome behavior rather than martyred accommodation of their daughter's inadequate hospitality. Allison, he said slowly, surely this is an overreaction to a family disagreement. Is it? I asked. Because from my perspective, this is a reasonable response to 2 weeks of you treating my home like your personal project, my workspace. Like an inconvenience, my boundaries like suggestions, and my requests for basic consultation like evidence of selfishness. My mother was reading her copy with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for restaurant bills she suspected might contain errors. This says we can't contact you except through legal channels, she said, her voice rising slightly. Are you actually cutting us off over a disagreement about hospitality? I'm protecting myself from people who think that sleeping in my garage is an appropriate response to being asked to respect basic boundaries, I said. People who turn family visits into renovation projects, social events into obligations. I didn't agree to, and reasonable requests for consultation into evidence of my character flaws. The legal documents had shifted the entire dynamic of our conversation. Instead of defending my decisions against their emotional manipulation, I was stating facts that were now backed by legal authority. Instead of feeling guilty for disappointing them, I was watching them realize that their manipulation tactics had consequences they hadn't anticipated. You're really going to do this? My father asked, holding up the cease and desist letter. Like it was evidence of some betrayal rather than a natural consequence of their behavior. You're really going to choose legal action over family relationships? You chose garage sleeping over guest room accommodations, I replied. You chose proving points about my inadequacy over finding solutions that respected everyone's needs. You chose manipulation over communication, punishment over compromise. I'm just choosing to protect myself from people who think that's acceptable behavior. Kevin checked his watch with the kind of professional attention to detail that reminded everyone present that this was now a legal matter with specific timeframes and requirements. You have until noon to remove all personal belongings from the property, he informed my parents. After that time, any remaining items will be considered abandoned and disposed of accordingly. Noon. 5 hours to pack up not just their belongings, but the wreckage of family relationships that had been building toward this moment for years. 5 hours to process the fact that their manipulation tactics had finally met someone who was willing to use legal systems to enforce boundaries they couldn't maintain through emotional appeals. As they began the process of loading their luggage into their rental car, moving with the stunned efficiency of people who were still processing what had just happened, I stood in my driveway watching the end of something that had probably been over long before this morning. The garage sleeping had been their final attempt to punish me for choosing my own needs over their preferences, but it had also been the evidence I needed to finally protect myself from people who loved me conditionally and treated that conditional love like a weapon. By 8 o'clock, their car was packed and they were standing in my driveway like refugees from a disaster they'd created themselves, holding legal documents that made it clear this wasn't a temporary disagreement that would blow over with time and Christmas cards. This was a permanent change in our relationship status, enforced by law and backed by authorities who didn't care about family history or genetic connections. My mother made one final attempt at emotional manipulation, her voice breaking slightly. As she said, "I hope you're happy with what you've accomplished here, Allison. I hope this is really what you wanted." What I wanted was parents who could visit my home without taking it over, who could offer suggestions without turning them into requirements, who could accept basic boundaries without turning them into evidence of my selfishness. What I wanted was family relationships based on mutual respect rather than my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for their comfort. What I wanted was family who could treat me like an adult capable of making my own decisions about my own life, I said. Since that apparently wasn't possible, yes, this is what I wanted. They drove away at 8:30 in the morning, 3 hours before their original flight time and almost 6 hours before the noon deadline Kevin had established for their departure. As I watched their rental car disappear down the street that led away from my neighborhood, I felt something settle into place that hadn't been there for as long as I could remember. Peace. Not the temporary quiet that comes after arguments end, but the deep, permanent peace that comes from knowing you're safe from people who love you just enough to hurt you, but not enough to respect you. The hours immediately following my parents' departure passed in a strange suspended silence, as if the house itself was adjusting to the absence of tension that had permeated every room for 2 weeks. I walked through each space methodically, not cleaning so much as reclaiming, moving furniture back to positions that made sense for my daily life rather than for photography sessions or social events I'd never agreed to host. The guest room felt enormous without their belongings scattered across every surface. I'd grown so accustomed to navigating around their suitcases and equipment that the empty floor space seemed almost unnatural. I stripped the bed they'd abandoned in favor of garage sleeping, washing sheets that still smelled faintly of my mother's expensive perfume and my father's aftershave, erasing the lingering evidence of their presence from my space. In the garage, I found the camping equipment I'd provided for their self-imposed concrete floor experience, neatly folded and stacked as if they'd been careful to leave no trace of their martyrdom. The space heater was unplugged and pushed back against the wall. The foam mats were rolled and secured with the kind of military precision my father brought to all organizational tasks. Even their dramatic gesture of sleeping in my garage had been executed with methodical attention to detail. I stood in the empty garage for several minutes, trying to process what had happened in the space 12 hours earlier. My parents had chosen to sleep here, on concrete floors, surrounded by storage boxes and tools, rather than accept guest room accommodations that came with the basic expectation that they respect my autonomy in my own home. The symbolism wasn't lost on me, they'd literally chosen discomfort over acknowledging my right to set boundaries. But what struck me more than the symbolism was the calculation behind their choice. This hadn't been an emotional reaction or a moment of hurt feelings that led to poor decision-making. This had been a strategic move designed to make me feel guilty, to prove a point about my inadequacy as a daughter and hostess, to create a story they could tell about their suffering at the hands of their ungrateful child. The phone started ringing around 10 o'clock that morning, and it didn't stop for the next 3 days. The first call was from Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who'd apparently received a detailed account of their Arizona experience before their plane had even taken off. Her voice carried the carefully neutral tone that family members use when they're trying to gather information without taking obvious sides in a conflict they don't fully understand. "Allison, honey," she began, "I just heard about what happened with your parents' visit. Your mother mentioned there were some difficulties, and I wanted to check in and see how you're doing." "Some difficulties?" As if 2 weeks of systematic boundary violations culminating in garage sleeping and legal eviction notices could be summarized as minor interpersonal friction. But I'd learned to recognize the family communication style that turned major conflicts into small misunderstandings, that reframed abuse as difficulty and manipulation as caring concern gone slightly awry. "I'm doing well," I said honestly. "Better than I have in a long time, actually." There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to understand that my response wasn't what Aunt Linda had expected to hear. In the family narrative that was already being constructed around this incident, I was supposed to be remorseful, possibly devastated by the consequences of my poor choices, ready to apologize and repair relationships that had been damaged by my unreasonable behavior. "Your mother said there was some kind of legal action," Aunt Linda continued carefully. "She's quite upset about being served with papers. I have to say, that seems like a rather extreme response to whatever disagreements you were having." Extreme response. The phrase that would become a recurring theme in every conversation I had with family members over the next several weeks. Somehow my decision to protect myself from people who'd spent 2 weeks treating my home like their personal vacation property was extreme, while their choice to sleep in my garage rather than accept reasonable boundaries was just a reasonable reaction to my difficult behavior. "The legal action was necessary," I said calmly. "They were asked to respect basic boundaries about my space and my autonomy, and instead of finding ways to compromise, they chose to escalate the situation by sleeping in my garage to prove a point about my inadequacy." "Sleeping in the garage?" Aunt Linda's voice sharpened with genuine surprise. "I thought they said the guest room wasn't suitable." And there it was, the first crack in the narrative my parents had constructed about their Arizona experience. They'd told their version of events to family members, but they'd apparently edited out the part where they'd deliberately chosen concrete floors over comfortable accommodations because accepting my hospitality would have required acknowledging my right to set boundaries. "The guest room was perfectly suitable for 10 days, I explained. "They chose the garage for their final night because they wanted to make a statement about how unwelcoming I was after I refused to let them host social events in my home without consulting me." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Aunt Linda gradually extracting more details about what had actually happened during their visit. By the end, her tone had shifted from concerned family member trying to facilitate reconciliation to someone who was beginning to understand that this situation was more complex than she'd initially been led to believe. "I had no idea it had gotten so bad," she said finally. "Your mother made it sound like you'd just gotten overwhelmed and overreacted to normal family dynamics." Normal family dynamics. The phrase that had been used to excuse boundary violations and emotional manipulation throughout my childhood and into my adult life. The idea that systematic disrespect was just how families operated, that learning to tolerate unacceptable behavior was a sign of maturity and emotional health. "Maybe for our family," I said. "But I've decided I want different dynamics in my relationships going forward." After I hung up, I realized that Aunt Linda's call was just the beginning of what would become a sustained campaign to pressure me into reconciliation. Over the next few days, I received calls from cousins, family friends, and distant relatives who'd all heard versions of the story and wanted to encourage me to reconsider my extreme response to what they'd been told was a minor family disagreement. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial concern for my well-being, gentle probing for my version of events, growing understanding of the actual dynamics that had led to legal action, and finally, a kind of uncomfortable silence as the person on the other end of the phone processed the gap between what they'd been told and what had actually happened. By Thursday afternoon, I'd talked to enough family members to piece together the story my parents were telling about their Arizona experience. In their version, they'd come to visit their daughter who was struggling to maintain her grandmother's old house. They'd offered helpful suggestions for improvements and tried to provide support for her small business by introducing her to potential clients. When she'd become overwhelmed and hostile to their assistance, they'd graciously accepted less comfortable sleeping arrangements rather than burden her further. And when she'd overreacted to their attempts to help by serving them with legal papers, they'd reluctantly accepted that she needed space to work through whatever emotional issues were causing her to push away family who loved her. It was a masterful narrative construction, one that contained just enough truth to be believable while completely inverting the power dynamics and motivations that had actually driven the conflict. In their story, they were the generous parents being punished for their love and support. I was the emotionally unstable daughter who'd rejected their help and chosen legal action over family reconciliation. But what surprised me was how little their narrative affected me. A month earlier, hearing that my parents were telling people I was emotionally unstable and ungrateful would have sent me into spirals of self-doubt and desperate attempts to correct the record. Now, having experienced the peace that came from enforcing boundaries regardless of their emotional reactions, I found that their story said more about them than it did about me. Kevin called Friday morning to check in and see if there had been any violations of the cease and desist order. Some people test boundaries after legal action, he explained. Drive by the house, leave messages, send letters through intermediaries. Has there been any contact? There hadn't been. My parents were many things, but they weren't stupid enough to violate legal orders that could result in police involvement. Whatever emotional manipulation tactics they might employ through family members, they understood that direct contact with me was now a matter for law enforcement rather than family drama. What happens now? I asked. Do I need to do anything else to maintain the legal boundaries? Just document everything, Kevin advised. Save any messages from family members trying to facilitate contact. Keep records of any attempts to circumvent the no-contact order, maintain copies of all the legal paperwork. Most family situations like this either resolve themselves over time or escalate to the point where more serious legal action becomes necessary. More serious legal action. The phrase reminded me that what had happened with my parents might not be the end of this conflict but rather the beginning of a longer process of establishing and maintaining boundaries with people who weren't accustomed to having their behavior limited by anything other than their own preferences. But I wasn't afraid of escalation anymore. The past week had taught me that legal systems existed specifically to protect people like me from people like my parents, and that using those systems wasn't evidence of personal failure but rather evidence of emotional health and self-respect. The weekend brought a different kind of silence, one that felt less like aftermath and more like beginning. Saturday morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own house, with no one else's schedule to accommodate and no one else's preferences to consider. I made coffee exactly the way I liked it, using the coffee maker my mother had deemed inadequate. I ate breakfast at my own dining table, which was no longer covered with someone else's photography equipment. I worked in my living room office space without background music I hadn't chosen or interruptions from people who thought my professional obligations were less important than their social needs. It was, I realized, the first morning in 2 weeks when I'd felt like myself in my own home. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor, though not the kind that required legal intervention. Mrs. Thompson from next door knocked on my front door around noon, carrying a plate of the chocolate chip cookies she was famous for throughout the neighborhood. I wanted to check on you, she said with the straightforward kindness that made her one of my favorite neighbors. I saw your parents leaving early the other morning with their luggage, and you seemed a little tense during their visit. Everything okay? Mrs. Thompson was in her 70s and had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone else. She'd known my grandmother well and had been one of the people who'd encouraged me to buy the house when it went on the market. More importantly, she was someone who understood that good fences made good neighbors, and that family relationships weren't automatically exempt from normal standards of courtesy and respect. It's been a challenging few weeks, I said honestly. But I think things are going to be much better going forward. She nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from decades of observing family dynamics and neighborhood drama. Your grandmother used to say that the hardest part of growing up wasn't learning to take care of yourself, she said. It was learning to protect yourself from people who thought love gave them the right to treat you badly. The observation was so perfectly accurate that I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time since my parents had driven away. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of recognition and relief. Someone understood what had actually happened here, someone saw the difference between love that respected boundaries and love that demanded the sacrifice of autonomy. She also used to say that this house had good energy for people who needed to start over, Mrs. Thompson continued with a small smile. Looks like she was right about that too. Monday morning brought the return of my normal routine, and I was surprised by how profoundly different everything felt even though nothing in my external circumstances had actually changed. I was still living in the same house, working at the same job, following the same daily patterns I'd established over the past 3 years. But something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my own life. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for other people's approval of my choices. I wasn't second-guessing my decisions based on what my parents might think or say about them. I wasn't maintaining a constant state of readiness to defend my autonomy against people who thought family relationships gave them unlimited access to my life and my space. The work I'd been unable to complete during my parents' visit came together with surprising ease once I could focus without interruption. The client presentation I'd been dreading went better than expected, partly because I wasn't carrying the emotional exhaustion that had built up over 2 weeks of constant accommodation and conflict. By Tuesday afternoon, I realized I was experiencing something I'd never had before, genuine peace in my own home. Not the temporary calm that comes after arguments end, but the deep quiet that comes from knowing you're safe from people who love you conditionally and use that conditional love as a weapon. Wednesday brought a phone call that would test the strength of my newfound boundaries in ways I hadn't anticipated. Brandon called from Denver, his voice carrying the carefully modulated concern he'd learned during his various therapy and meditation experiences. Allison, he began in the tone he used when he was about to deliver wisdom he thought I needed to hear. I've been talking to Mom and Dad about what happened during their visit, and I really think there might be some misunderstandings. That could be cleared up if everyone just communicated more openly. Misunderstandings. The word that was apparently going to be used to reframe 2 weeks of systematic boundary violations and manipulation as simple communication failures that could be resolved with better dialogue. But I'd learned to recognize Brandon's communication style, which involved reinterpreting other people's experiences until they aligned with whatever spiritual or psychological framework he was currently exploring. There weren't any misunderstandings, I said calmly. They wanted to treat my home like their vacation rental and me like staff whose job was to accommodate their preferences. When I set boundaries, they chose to sleep in my garage rather than accept guest room accommodations that came with basic expectations of respect. I chose legal action rather than continue tolerating behavior that was harmful to my mental health and sense of autonomy. Brandon was quiet for a moment, apparently processing the fact that I wasn't interested in his interpretation of my experiences or his suggestions for how I should handle my own life. That seems like a pretty harsh way to characterize people who love you and were just trying to help, he said finally. People who love me don't sleep in my garage to prove points about my inadequacy, I replied. People who love me don't ignore my requests for basic consultation about plans that affect my home and my schedule. People who love me don't spend 2 weeks criticizing my choices and then frame their criticism as help I should be grateful for. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Brandon becoming increasingly frustrated by my refusal to accept his reframing of the situation as a communication problem that could be solved with better emotional processing on everyone's part. By the end, he was using the slightly patronizing tone he employed when he thought someone was being resistant to personal growth and spiritual development. I just think you're choosing anger over forgiveness, he said. And that's going to hurt you more than it hurts them. I'm not choosing anger, I said. I'm choosing boundaries. And if those boundaries hurt people who can't respect them, that says more about them than it does about me. After I hung up, I realized that Brandon's call had been another test of the psychological changes that had occurred during the past week. A month ago, his spiritual authority routine might have made me doubt my own perceptions and decisions. His suggestion that I was choosing anger over forgiveness might have sent me into spirals of self-examination and guilt about my response to my parents' behavior. But now, having experienced the peace that came from enforcing boundaries regardless of other people's emotional reactions, I could see his manipulation tactics clearly. He was trying to use concepts like forgiveness and personal growth to pressure me into accepting treatment that was harmful to my mental health and sense of autonomy. The recognition was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't just learning to protect myself from my parents' manipulation, I was learning to recognize and resist manipulation from anyone who tried to use love, family obligations, or spiritual concepts to override my own judgment about what was healthy for me. Thursday afternoon brought a conversation that would change everything in ways I hadn't anticipated. Aunt Linda called again, but this time her tone was different, less concerned family member and more someone who'd been thinking carefully about our previous conversation. Allison, she said without preamble, I need to tell you something that I probably should have said years ago. Your mother called me yesterday upset because Brandon couldn't talk you into reconciliation, and she started saying things about you that weren't okay. Things about your mental health and your ability to maintain relationships. I waited, not sure where this conversation was heading but sensing that something important was about to shift. The thing is, Aunt Linda continued, she said similar things about other family members over the years when they've disappointed her or failed to meet her expectations. And I've always justified it as stress or worry or her just being protective of family relationships. But listening to her yesterday, I realized that what she was doing was character assassination designed to make everyone else in the family think there was something wrong with you rather than something wrong with her behavior. Character assassination. The phrase hung in the air between us, carrying implications that extended far beyond the current conflict about my parents' visit. This wasn't just about garage sleeping and legal boundaries, this was about a pattern of behavior that had been affecting family relationships for years. I started thinking about other times when family members had conflicts with your parents. Aunt Linda said. Your cousin David who stopped coming to family gatherings after your father criticized his career choices repeatedly. Your Uncle Mark who cut contact after your mother made comments about his wife's parenting. In every case, the story became about how these family members were emotionally unstable or ungrateful or unable to handle normal family dynamics. The pattern recognition was profound and disturbing. I'd always thought I was the problem family member, the one who was too sensitive or demanding or unable to accept normal family relationships. But what Aunt Linda was describing suggested that anyone who challenged my parents' behavior was systematically reframed as the problem, while their behavior was protected from examination by redirecting attention to their victims' supposed psychological issues. I'm telling you this, Aunt Linda continued, because I want you to know that there are family members who see what's actually happening here. You're not crazy, you're not overreacting, and you're not the first person to be targeted this way. You're just the first person to document it and involve legal systems that can't be manipulated with family guilt trips. The validation was overwhelming in the best possible way. For my entire adult life, I'd questioned my own perceptions when they conflicted with my parents' version of reality. I'd assumed that my discomfort with their behavior was evidence of my own psychological problems rather than evidence of their problematic behavior patterns. What should I do with this information? I asked. Whatever you need to do to protect yourself, Aunt Linda said firmly. And know that you have family members who support your right to set boundaries, even if they're not the family members you expected support from. Friday evening, exactly 1 week after my parents had driven away with their legal eviction notices, I stood in my living room looking at the space I'd reclaimed from their renovation projects and social events and photography sessions. The furniture was arranged for my comfort and daily routines rather than for optimal camera angles. The guest room was empty and peaceful, available for visitors who could accept hospitality that came with basic expectations of respect. The garage was back to being a garage, not a performance space for elaborate guilt trips about family loyalty and gratitude. But more than the physical changes, something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my own life. I was no longer living in a constant state of readiness to defend my choices against people who thought love gave them unlimited access to my space and my autonomy. I was no longer maintaining relationships based on my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for other people's comfort. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own values and preferences rather than constantly adjusting those values to accommodate people who thought family relationships exempted them from normal standards of respect and consideration. The peace that came with that realization was deeper and more permanent than anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't the temporary quiet that comes after conflicts resolve, it was the profound calm that comes from knowing you're finally safe from people who use love as a weapon and family obligations as a tool for control. Saturday morning, I woke up in my own house and made coffee exactly the way I liked it, using equipment I'd chosen for my own preferences rather than for other people's approval. I sat at my grandmother's writing desk, which was back in its proper place by the window where she'd written letters for 40 years, and I wrote my own letter. Not to my parents, who'd forfeited the right to direct communication when they'd chosen garage sleeping over boundary respect. Not to family members who were trying to facilitate reconciliation by minimizing abuse as misunderstanding. But to my future self, documenting the lessons I'd learned and the boundaries I'd established so I'd never forget how much better life became when I stopped trying to earn love from people who were determined to withhold it. The letter ended with a promise that I would never again sacrifice my peace for other people's comfort, never again accept treatment I wouldn't tolerate from strangers just because it came from family members, never again apologize for protecting myself from people who thought love gave them the right to treat me badly. As I sealed the letter and placed it in my grandmother's desk drawer next to her fountain pen, I realized that her real gift to me hadn't been the house itself. It had been the foundation for a life where I could make my own choices about who I let into my space and under what conditions, where I could love people without allowing them to hurt me, where I could honor family relationships that were based on mutual respect while protecting myself from family members who confused love with control. The garage would always be there, a reminder of what people were willing to do to prove points about my inadequacy. But it would also be a reminder of what I was willing to do to protect my peace, my autonomy, and my right to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. And every morning when I made coffee in my kitchen and looked out at the garden my grandmother had planted, I would remember that the hardest part of growing up wasn't learning to take care of myself, it was learning to protect myself from people who thought love gave them the right to treat me badly. I had finally learned that lesson, and my life was immeasurably better for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.